So with that, I'm so excited to introduce our incredible panelists that we have here today. So we have Abby here, who's the DEI program specialist at Uncork. We have Ronnie, who is previously was the head of employee advocacy at Adobe and currently the customer storyteller. And we have Beth here, who's the senior manager of ERG Programs, diversity and inclusion at Etsy. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, I'm so excited to get this started. So I shared a little bit about each of you, just your roles and where you are, but I'd love to learn a little bit about how each of you actually got to doing the type of work that you do. I think it's so fascinating how, especially in community and in these types of roles, I don't think anybody ever sets out to do this type of work, and we all sort of fall into it. So I'd love to hear a little bit about each of your journeys. So I'll start with Beth for this one.
Thank you so much. And hello, everyone. My name is Beth Wiesendonger. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm super excited to be here. I've been in the community building sphere for a very long time. I grew up in California. I now live in New York, but I am disabled. I'm a double amputee and a prosthetic user. And when I was growing up in my small town, there weren't any other children with disabilities at my school. No one in my family had a disability. And so that experience felt a little bit isolating. It was also the 90s, which was very much, your disability doesn't define you, or you're only as disabled as you allow yourself to feel, which was a very strange narrative to hear, but then also experience that to other people, the fact that I had a disability did matter, right? So I'm also very thankful that I grew up with the internet, and I was able to connect to other disabled folks, people who are really steeped in disability advocacy and disability justice through the internet. And what I found was that our identities, oftentimes, we're told from a young age to suppress these things about ourselves, but they can be so empowering and so fulfilling to embrace and to really connect with other people over what makes us unique, what makes us, right? So I fell in love with that kind of work. I got more and more involved with community advocacy for different intersectional identities, and out of school started doing a lot of campaign work, voter education, fundraising, awareness activities. I worked with the Planned Parenthood Action Fund, the ACLU, the Sierra Club, Nature Conservancy, and UNICEF, and then did human resources management for several years, focused on DEI training and employee engagement with Target, and then pivoted into tech in 2016 with a company called Fiverr, where I really built their ERG program from ground up and focused on a lot of DEI initiatives, and found my way to Etsy, where I'm senior manager of our ERG program. So super happy to be here.
That's incredible. Thank you so much for sharing your journey. Really, really inspiring how much you have done in the space. Avi, I'll jump to you next. Can you share a little bit about your journey and how you ended up doing this kind of work?
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having us, Bevy, and it's great to be here with all of you today. My name is Abby Zabo. I go by she, her pronouns, and I'm the DEI program specialist at Uncork, where we focus on DEI programs, learning and development, and all of our employee resource strategy groups. So a little about me. I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi, a place with a rich history, but enduring struggle for equity and inclusion. And growing up in Mississippi, I witnessed so many disparities and lack of access and opportunity for communities of color, especially the Black community, which got me really invested in this work from a young age. I had a wonderful mentor in high school who started helping us connect the dots, taking us on field trips around the state. And I started grassroots programs that connected the dots between legislation, education, race, and access to opportunities. So from a very young age, I've had this fire inside of me that's brought together passion and purpose and has led me to this line of work. So I'm thrilled to be here today. Thanks for having us.
That's amazing. Very cool. It's interesting that both of you, sort of your upbringing kind of shaped your view of this type of work and got you into doing such impactful work as well. Ronnie, I'll jump to you next. Can you share a little bit about your journey and how you got into doing this type of work?
Sure. So, hi, everybody. Good morning. I think my journey is probably a bit different from Abby's and Beth's in that I actually kind of ran away from this work. I mean, one, I was not very aware of this work until joining Adobe 13 years ago. And at Adobe, the basic philosophy is that if you are included and respected and valued, you could be far more successful and innovative and creative, right? And so including folks and respecting them and valuing them is really the holy grail. And I thought, wow, there is something really, really special about that, right? And so when I say I ran away from that work, I mean, I too am disabled, Beth, and, growing up, it was really, hide it, it's shameful, don't talk about it. Your whole purpose in life is to assimilate and be part of mainstream. And so this notion of grouping people based on background and characteristics and identity was very much something you were discouraged from doing, right? And so upon joining Adobe and seeing the uniqueness and the value that comes from finding your tribe, if you will, right, was really, really empowering and encouraging. And so that's where I leaned into. I mean, it's not my day job, as I was explaining to Marcia. I lead one of our 8 networks, our Access at Adobe network. I'm the executive chair for that. And so that's really my involvement, but we do a lot of things intersectionally with the other networks. And as we have this discussion today, we'll get into the value to the bottom line and just how much this work does for the betterment of society, let alone the company, right? So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for sharing your journey. A couple of things I'll point out before we sort of jump into the rest of the panel. Beth, thank you so much for answering the question in the chat as well. I just saw it in the Q&A. So for anybody who's sort of new to the space and exploring, DEI stands for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And I'm sure we'll be using that acronym a lot, so great to kind of get that out there right away. Also, Ronnie, you touched on something really interesting. I think a lot of folks here in the audience and past panels that we've done on this theme, a lot of the time it's not the full-time role that you sort of focus on, but there's so much business impact and so much passion that goes into it. So we're going to dive into all of that. I'd love to hear from folks in the chat as well. Like, is ERG and internal community your full-time role, or is it something that you've taken on as like a passion project and on volunteer basis? Would love to get a sense from the community of folks that's here. Awesome. Okay, so you've each shared a little bit about your journeys and how you got into this type of work. I'd love to get a little bit more specific and learn about the programs that you run within your current roles, and just a little bit about that, what kind of programs you're running and who your community members are. So let's kick it off with Abby this time.
So at Uncork, we have 9 employee resource strategy groups, also known as ERGs. We throw that strategy in there. These 9 support Uncork's caregivers, our women identifying employees, our LGBTQIA identifying employees, our Black, Latinx, Middle Eastern, Asian, and veteran communities. We also have a group focused on accessibility and mental health. And these groups support all kinds of programming, from in-house mentorships to other forms of professional development, like bringing in career coaches, attending major conferences, creating peer-to-peer development opportunities, to things like fundraising for amazing causes, or just holding space for folks to show up and be their authentic selves in a safe space.
Very cool. Beth, I'll jump to you next. Can you share a little bit about the ERG programs within ETSI?
Yeah, so we currently have 10 employee resource groups at ETSI. We have accessibility and disability. We have an Asian resource community, Black resource and identity group at ETSI, our Hispanic and Latinx network, JETSI, which is ETSI's Jewish identity group, marginalized genders identity community, mental health at ETSI, parents at Etsy, queer at Etsy, and then new in the past year is remotes at Etsy, specifically really focusing around equity in remotes involvement throughout the organization. And my role, I am a dedicated ERG program manager. So I always tell folks that too long didn't read. I'm really there to make their lives easier so they can focus on impact and not so much about the logistical, administrative, budgetary aspects of running an ERG, but they can really focus about impact for their own community, for communities across Etsy as an organization, and then the impact they can have for external communities as well. So I really help them advocate up and create transparency down from the highest levels in the company to our ERG communities.
That's very cool. And Ronnie, I'll jump to you next. Can you share a little bit about the 8 groups that you have going on?
Yeah, so at Adobe, we've got the Access at Adobe, we've got the Black Employee Network, we've got Asian Pacific Islander. The newest of our network is Indigenous people at Adobe. Oh gosh, the LGBTQ plus. So basically pretty much everything Abby and Beth has said. I mean, we're minus a few, like we don't have Middle Eastern, we don't have a remote, we don't have the Jewish communities. So, but the mainstream kind of 8, and the newest being the Indigenous. And in my role, I'm specifically the executive chair for Access, but across the 8 networks, we do pretty much a lot of the same things. You know, as Abby was saying, holding space. That we recently had a Let's Talk session specifically for Access members, where we talked about, and it was in partnership with the licensed counselor, in terms of having someone come and hold a session for our group to talk through any anxieties folks were having about returning to work, how the disability community has felt like the pandemic has kind of leveled the playing field. And now that we're in this hybrid space, is this going to be different? Are we going to go revert back to feeling like we're at a disadvantage, right? So those were really important discussions to have. We have cultural moments like Disability Awareness Month and programming for that, as well as International Day of Persons with Disability and global programming around that. We too do a lot of fundraising, whether it be volunteer work in terms of investing our time and talents, or actually donating to various organizations that work through whatever causes that each of the networks support, right? But then we also do work around advancing careers, right? You know, I always say you have to be able to see what you want to be. And often, you know, people with disabilities or any of these underrepresented groups, you don't see very much high in the totem pole. And so our plight has been, how do we recruit from these communities? How do we make sure there's advancement and intentional advancement of that, right? So that's just a smattering of things that we focus on.
That's incredible. It sounds like there's quite a bit of overlap in what you all shared, but some really unique ERGs within each of your respective companies as well. And it's really interesting how, you know, it's constantly evolving, and, you know, a lot of the time these things are sort of co-created with the folks within your company, and really created on a basis where, you know, somebody finds a need for it, and it's created. So Beth, I'll jump to you next. Can you share a little bit about like why you think ERGs matter, and why employees should join, and why companies should really invest in them?
Yeah, definitely. It's a great question. And I think, you know, I'll start by saying that employee resource groups, really their aim is to create a positive and inclusive workplace culture, right? Where employees from all underrepresented backgrounds have access to programming that really fosters a sense of community, can contribute to their professional development, and work to amplify diverse voices within the organization. So the main goal is to create safe spaces for employees, really strengthen those social connections and professional networks, and really build the organization as a whole, their level of collective cultural intelligence, and increase equitable opportunity. So I think there's a lot of benefits for an employee to join, right? To find your people, right? The people that you connect with, that you share characteristics with, that may be experiencing some of the same things as you, get more access to career growth, professional development opportunities, and really have a fulfilling, inclusive experience in the workplace. And from the company perspective, I mean, besides it being very fundamentally the right thing to do, right? We tend to talk about DEI. I mean, you see that group together, diversity, equity, inclusion, is sort of a bucket term, but it's not a bucket term, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion are three separate pillars of what makes a DEI strategy. Diversity, of course, is the breakdown of who is working in your organization. Equity is making sure that all practices are equitable, but inclusion is that sense of belonging, the feeling that you can authentically come to your workplace and be yourself and know that you will be accepted, and not only accepted, but really appreciated for who you are. So as an organization, ERGs are a wonderful space that help with that feeling of inclusion. And really, we'll talk about this a little bit more when we dig deeper into business impact. Our ERGs are doing a lot of really constructive, meaningful, important work for the organization. And we are really reliant on having that direct line of communication to our underrepresented communities. So we can not only hear feedback, right, but take action on that feedback, and always, always, always be progressing on our practices and our programming to make sure we're as inclusive as possible.
That's fantastic. So elaborating on that a little bit further, Abby, how do you think that companies should be thinking about ERGs from a strategy perspective?
That's a fantastic question, because we add the word strategy in our employee resource groups. So at Uncork, we say ERSG for the strategy piece. So you may hear me switch between ERG and ERSG. But Uncork's VP of Global Inclusion, Netta Jenkins, actually coined the term employee resource strategy groups, because we believe ERSGs have a true mission and purpose in the workplace. So beyond being communities of people coming together to create safe spaces and support wonderful initiatives, ERSGs must be an integral part of an organization's DEI strategy. And there must be purpose and policy in the way that ERGs operate and contribute to a company's growth, right? So strategy really plays into all facets of our ERSGs, starting with the makeup and structure of each team. So each ERG is staffed with a president, a vice president, a researcher, a secretary, and a treasurer. And each of these roles serve a different purpose and contribute uniquely to the group. Additionally, we pay our ERG leaders for their time working on ERG initiatives. So oftentimes, a big gap we see in organizations is the lack of recognition or the lack of commitment for the work that ERG members are doing. So it's not only a lot of time and effort to see initiatives through, this work can be mentally taxing, and it's something that should be recognized either through performance reviews or end-of-year bonuses or extra compensation for leaders' time, or some combination of these things. And so we are extremely proud to pay our ERSG leaders based on the hours that they contribute each week to their group. Another strategy piece is funding the groups, right? So if doable, funding goes a long way for ERSGs. Uncork ERSGs are funded with an annual budget of $25,000. So this gives leaders an accommodating amount of money to carry out their programming, hire speakers, mentors, career coaches, to fund scholarships, sponsorships, partnerships, really gives them the ability to drive impact. So a huge strategy piece for organizations to think about for ERGs is the support of executive sponsors. So like Ronnie said, is being an executive chair. These sponsors can use their expertise and can leverage their networks to broaden ERG's impact. So at Uncork, our executive sponsors also form relationships with each leader so that they can learn about the work that ERG leads do and share that work with their managers and other stakeholders at the organization. So this actually helps ERG leaders propel in their careers, and it gains exposure for their leadership efforts. So executive sponsors can help create level of buy-in at all levels by supporting and championing this work. So I think a really strategic approach for any company, whether you're just beginning your ERG journey or you have mature ERGs, is to legitimize this work by recognizing leaders for their contributions, involving senior level leaders to be part of the process. And with that level of buy-in, ERGs become something that everyone will want to be a part of. It becomes a no-brainer.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Beth, I know in our conversation, you're also somebody that's very passionate about the compensation side of ERGs and really advocating for the need of that. What are you sort of seeing in the industry with companies moving towards this model, and like any other thoughts you want to share on compensation?
Yeah, I am a big advocate for it because, like Abby was mentioning, there's an emotional labor aspect of what ERG leaders are doing, and it is work. And as an organization, as we dig deeper into the impact of how ERGs have an effect on our business, the work is meaningful, right? It really has data-driven results. And we often, as an organization, rely on our ERG leaders in times of crisis, right? In times of greater need. And these things are big asks, and they deserve to be recognized both financially and in terms of, annual performance reviews, recognition, all of those things, right? So it's incredibly important that the work is recognized, and I am a big advocate for it. I think it's still a very inconsistent practice across the industry. You see a lot of organizations that really aren't comping ERG leaders at all, whether that's, through stock options, through RSUs, through stipends, whatever it may be. And then you see some organizations who are very progressive and open about how they're compensating their ERG leaders. So there's not really a benchmark, but I think it's very important that if you're thinking about really investing in your ERG community, asking yourself what's the best way to do that, and to also maintain a very flexible approach to how you're thinking about compensation year over year, right? So always pushing to be as progressive as possible and understanding that what you're asking has real emotional labor implications for the folks who are participating in that work.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think, you both touched on like how much of a business impact that has. Ronnie, I'd love to jump to you and chat a little bit about how you actually empower employees to be Adobe's biggest brand ambassadors, and how do ERGs fit into this work?
Basically, what it's about, Marsha, is encouraging and empowering everyone to be part of our marketing efforts, right? In terms of employees are the most trusted voice in the company. Employees ultimately humanize the brand. And so our job is to help them create and curate content that they can put out so that Adobe's logo becomes these names and faces and personalities become what's behind our logo, right? So there's training, there's um, basically building confidence in employees to say, you've got really important networks out there and you've got really important things to say, and you're one of the most trusted voices. So let's do this give to get. Let's do something that's a win-win for both sides. So it's really about not only encouraging but expecting, right? Like I often say that if you are signing on, that means you actually believe in the company. So why wouldn't you want to be loud and proud, right? I know some companies are like, well, what if folks go off the rail, and do you really want them to advocate on behalf of the company? And my point is, if you don't, then you have a hiring issue, right? Like it's not a social media issue, it's actually a hiring problem. So um hope that answers that, Marsha.
For sure. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your perspective. Abby, you already touched a little bit about the types of roles that you have within your ERG. I'd love to get Beth's perspective on this as well, and especially, when starting out, do you have any suggestions around key roles that an ERG should have to be successful? And when setting it up, like a brand new ERG within a company, how do you put the right tools and processes in place from the beginning?
Yeah. Definitely. So I think, Abby, you did touch on a lot of these, but I do think, to reiterate, it's very important to have a structured and defined idea of what the leadership team looks like and the roles within the leadership team. And you really want to make sure that across each ERG, the size and defined roles of your ERG leadership teams is equitable to ensure that it's the most equitable experience possible, from ERG to ERG to ERG, right? I also think that, the executive sponsor is key, because you need somebody who has that overall organizational awareness to connect those ERG leaders to great opportunities, to impact moments on like the organizational company-wide calendar, to really have a broader awareness of, oh, you're saying that you're giving me feedback or hearing this from the community. This is the exact right person that you should talk to, and how we can make change immediately, right? And then by the same token, it's giving that executive sponsor like a really ground level view into how people are feeling at the company. And that's something that they can then take back with them to the broader executive team, right? So that executive sponsor piece is huge. I also think it's really important when starting an ERG to spend a lot of time in the beginning talking amongst interested community members. So they might not be formalized ERG leaders yet if we're starting a brand new community, but really talking amongst community members who have raised their hand and say they're interested in having this space, about the who, what, and why behind the ERG, right? And really crafting a mission statement that addresses those things that people feel really good about. The language feels inclusive. The impact that the ERG community wants to have is there. Because I always remind ERG leaders that while we're all super excited to do the work doesn't get done in 1 year by one team, right? It's work that continues to evolve and grows year after year after year after year. So when you're starting an ERG, you're really setting those foundational pillars up of strategy and impact. So spending a lot of time really growing the community in a grassroots way, connecting people, letting folks be heard, everyone providing input, and crafting something that everyone feels good about and is authentic to what the community sees and how they want to be represented is super important. And the last thing I'll say, as somebody who has a dedicated role in supporting ERGs, I would recommend that every organization has somebody, at least one person, who's in that role, who can really help ERG leaders scale their impact, who have the organizational connections and know-how to help ERG leaders see the big picture, to expand their impact, again, externally and internally, and to provide the resources that they need to get the work done. And that's budget, but that's also connecting folks to the right stakeholders, having time for the right conversations, right? So somebody who can really be a facilitator and an advocate for those ERG leaders, and someone to help them connect the dots.
Yeah, absolutely. Ronnie, I see you're nodding there as well.
Yeah. Yeah, so at Adobe, we have an actual dedicated D&I team. They're a small and mighty team, and there's like three senior program managers that oversee the 8 ERGs. They divide and conquer, like I think it's like two per person, 2 to 3 per person, and they become that conduit that Beth is talking about. They've got D&I or DE&I on their business card, right? So that's what they wake up every day thinking about, whereas ERG leaders and participants are voluntary positions. And yes, there is this notion of exclusive events and exclusive exec coaching, or having it be part of their performance, our performance reviews and whatnot, but it's not necessarily a paid role. And so I think these two things go hand in hand. I personally would love to see Adobe and other companies like Beth and Abby are saying move towards a more consistent payment model, because it is a lot of physical work in terms of hours put in, not to mention the emotional toll that we've talked about as well. And so, but I think this notion of having a D&I team to work in concert with you as ERG leaders, I think it's a fantastic model.
Yeah, absolutely. It really does seem to be critical. And, like you said, I think, like for currently it's volunteer, but I see a lot of companies moving towards it and, change is happening.
Yeah.
So it sounds like the way that you are supporting those volunteers and, the value that you do create for them, it's really valuable and important as well. Um, Abby, I'll jump to you next. Are there any examples that jump to mind of Uncork's most successful ESRG or DNI programs?
Yeah, and I'm actually going to piggyback off of what Ronnie just said about the connection between a DEI team and ERGs, or having someone to support those roles. So, a great way to drive successful DEI programming is to engage your ERGs, right? Utilize their networks, leverage their expertise and their unique position in the industry as you're implementing your DEI programming. A specific example, though, one of Uncork's primary DI initiatives is our Tech Track program. Uncork Tech Track is an equity program focused on performance-based opportunities. There are historical systemic gaps that largely play a role in blocking overlooked groups from careers in technology. And what we've done is created a hiring pipeline that supports overlooked populations in pivoting into a career in technology. This means we focus on folks with non-traditional tech backgrounds, and this pipeline's created by partnering with different technical training programs and boot camps, and then participants who are accepted into the program go through 4 weeks of intensive Uncork boot camp to learn our platform, and all who successfully complete receive full-time offers on one of our technical teams. So in 2021, we partnered with STEAM Train, a technical training program focused on women and overlooked populations, and Code Platoon, which is a coding boot camp for veteran and veteran spouses, to bring in participants for this pipeline, which resulted in hiring 7 individuals. And our ERSGs were able to foster these relationships with the boot camps, and to this day are continuously sharing new opportunities out in Cork with these boot camps graduating classes. And we also utilized our ERSG members to serve as mentors throughout the tech track journey and after. Another example of that is our Women X group. So another successful DI program we launched in 2021 is our No Boundaries program for women. And this was a leadership program for women identifying employees to learn how to drive their career and really gain the tools needed to intersect your purpose and power. And this program is evolving for next year, but to not only cover strategies for professional development and leadership, but also specifically focus on managerial and professional relationships, because those relationships are a huge driver in progressing your career. So during the No Boundaries program, our Women X ERSG also implemented a mentorship program where we paired more associate level women with more senior level women to explore monthly themes and challenges. So this really amplified the work that the DEI team was doing with No Boundaries. So we see a ton of traction and success when we can utilize our ERGs to help drive our DEI programming or amplify the work that our DEI team is already doing.
That's incredible. Thank you so much for sharing that. I want to jump into chatting about measuring success. I see that there's a couple of questions in the Q&A already. Scarlett has a question about that. So Ronnie, I'll jump to you. How do you capture relevant data to show the positive impact ERG events have on employee relations and business performance?
So we capture obviously attendance at events, a sentiment, right? And then we talk through like net promoter score and would you recommend Adobe to other companies? Because again, this notion of if you found your tribe and you have a sense of belonging, the chances are that you're going to bring more through the pipeline, that you're going to retain folks more. And from an employee engagement perspective, right? Engagement is what begets retention. I really believe that. And so ERGs, once you capture, we're starting to do cohort stuff where we're measuring people who are actively engaged in ERGs versus those who aren't, and looking at, can you actually say that you're retaining folks longer? And, we're just at the beginning stages of that kind of work. And that's the hypothesis. And we're slowly proving that out to be. And so I think, you don't try to boil the ocean. Let's start with a few things: sentiment, engagement, and see what that leads to in terms of retention and hiring. Because in this day and age, people really want to come to companies. It's a employees market, right? And so folks want to come to companies where there's purpose and there's a sense of belonging. And I really believe that can be your differentiator as a company.
Absolutely. Yeah, speaking on about engagement and retention, I also think that's a very important metric. Beth, what about you? Like, how do you measure that, and how do you frame that conversation?
Yeah, so I think, especially this year, a lot of you, I'm sure, have heard the phrase that there's the great resignation, right? Like this year, people are very worried about folks leaving. And so when we talk about attrition, a lot of times I think the conversation tends to be, how do we prevent loss? And what we're moving to, and what I would like to see everyone move to, is less how do we prevent loss, but rather, how do we really inspire people to stay, right? What programming are we putting forth that makes people want to be here? It feels connected to the workplace, right? And I think that ERGs are such a crucial component of that. And there's really two ways that you can look at data, right? You can look at data in your ERG by asking people, do you feel a sense of belonging here in this community? Do you feel that by being a part of this community, it's helped you navigate your career, or provided access to opportunities you wouldn't otherwise have had? Those are great questions to ask and get data on. But also you can look at, in your broader organizational engagement surveys, which I'm sure all of us do, right? Those questions: do you see yourself working here 2 years from now? Do you feel included in your workplace? And really understanding if, and I would suspect that 99.99% of times the answer is yes, folks who are involved in ERG communities, those answers will be much more positive than the general population of employees. So doing that comparative analysis, right, between your ERG communities and the broader population of your workplace will show that those folks who are engaged in ERGs are just more engaged overall, right? And it's so important when we're talking about things like retention and engagement, because it's not so much how are we keeping people from leaving, but how are we making people want to stay, and what programming can we provide that makes folks want to stay.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Like really, really great suggestions for specific questions there. And yeah, I recently did an interview with the founder of Donut for a podcast, and he shared a really similar sentiment around, just like, yeah, people who are involved in whether it's an ERG, or even if, they just feel connected, they have a best friend at work, is how he put it. Those scores and the engagement and retention it ends up being so much higher. So it's such an important thing to measure. Abby, what about? Oh, sorry.
Oh,
Go
sorry.
ahead.
Sorry, Bush. I was just going to jump in and say, I think the other why that I'm seeing is that when folks feel like they have their fingerprints on shaping the future of the company and, strategy, they feel invested, right? And that's another reason for people to want to stay. So I think we've talked a lot about using or leveraging the ERGs as trusted advisors. And, when that's the positioning of ERGs versus just put out a bunch of fun cultural events, which are absolutely needed as well. And that's a big part of what ERGs do and enjoy doing. But I think when you start thinking through the more strategic, the more consultative, leveraging ERGs as more experts and advisors, then it completely shifts the kind of why behind ERGs, and that, I actually can see my fingerprints on the future of Adobe. So the chances of me wanting to leave are next to none, right? So
Absolutely. Yeah, that's major. Abby, what about you? Are there any metrics or any unique ways that you measure success within your programs?
Actually we work with each individual team to develop DEI KPIs for their team. And each person at the organization has to take a piece of this goal. And it's part of the performance review. So you have to share the impact that you've had in this. So we have 3 pillars we focus on: recruiting and retention, growth and development, and engagement and branding. And the first step there is, we ask people to think about what are, what's the gender and ethnic makeup of your team, right? Assessing, why does your team look this way? Are there specific characteristics you're looking for when you're hiring? Is there a certain commonality among this group as far as backgrounds and skill sets go? And we try to, push the needle there. And that's supported by our implicit bias programming, by our L&D programming supports all of these KPIs. And then if teams are looking really good in that area, we're like, all right, think about growth and development. Do you as this team's manager know what each individual person is looking for in terms of growth on their team? Who wants to be a manager, who doesn't? Getting to know who your people are to the core and what is attractive to them is how you keep people. It's saying, hey, this is your next opportunity. This is what you're looking for, but I see this skill gap. This is how we're going to get you there. So that's kind of the growth and development piece. And then engagement and branding is that third step. It's saying, hey, we're doing all of this really well. This is more of a use case, or a case study. It's like, how do teams begin to create their own thesis about the impact that their teams are driving due to the growth opportunities on their team? So that's how we think about it. We track this through KPIs, and I'm very, very excited about our team growing because we now have a tech specialist on our team who is focused on DEI applications. I know this won't be applicable to every organization, but this DEI KPI tracker is each team is going to have to update, or each individual will have to update their KPI on a monthly basis. It's going to automatically ping them. And then at the end, if you want to close your KPI, say, oh, I did this goal, you have to share the impact of the goal. And so that's going to be a critical way for us to track in 2022.
And yeah, that's really great advice. Thank you. I see a question here from Gina. Abby, would you mind just repeating those 3 core focus areas again?
Sure. We focus on recruiting and retention, growth and development, and engagement and branding.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And folks, this is being recorded as well. So afterwards, we'll send this out. You can go back to any pieces of this as well. I know it's a lot of really great information. I'm trying to scribble down notes as well. But yeah, it's being recorded. All right. Let's see. So all of you actually have various ERGs within your companies. And it sounds like they're really working together and they're really an ally to each other. Ronnie, do you have any advice around that? How can ERGs be an ally to each other and help each other in their goals?
I'd say, have shared priorities, right? As you're setting strategies and priorities, actually be very on purpose and by design about those intersectional priorities. And so we as exec chairs, we have our own little powwows that we do on a monthly basis. And from an annual planning perspective, we get together and we kind of cross-pollinate our priorities, because when you have shared KPIs and shared goals, then it becomes a forcing function to work together. And then every time we're putting on programming, we ask, who else can we partner with amongst the 8 of us, right? And so I think just having those kind of predictable questions and checklists in place forces you to think through that kind of intersectionality. And, I guess I was just reading that in 2021, allyship was the word of the year. And so it's not just within ERGs, but I think just in general society, the concept of allyship is huge, right? We all need winds beneath our wings, if you will.
I love that. That's very cool. Beth, Abby, do you have any other thoughts or ideas around ERGs being allies to each other?
Yeah.
Go for it, Beth. Sorry.
Oh, yeah. I mean, definitely. I think All ERG leaders are ERG leaders for their respective ERGs, but they're ERG leaders fundamentally. So creating moments of time throughout the year where all ERG leaders are able to be in the same, perhaps virtual space, or have additional learning opportunities to grow with one another and get to know one another on a really individual level helps mindset where they're thinking intersectionally, right? Certainly as a program manager, when we're planning impact programming, I am always asking them to think critically about how can we partner and make this event more intersectional. We've had some really great intersectional events that have come out of that thought process and from folks really being comfortable and confident with chatting about really complex, difficult things with one another. And then I think it's also really important when you're establishing your ERGs to look for leaders who have really good intercultural competence and intelligence, or are very intersectional themselves, right? So many of our ERG leaders have an understanding that their identity is very intersectional, and they technically would qualify to lead many, many ERGs, right? But having them approach ERG leadership in a way that embraces all of their identities, right? Perhaps they're a parent and a woman and part of the queer community, and have a family member with a disability, right? All of these different things that make us who we are go into how we approach our day-to-day. So making that part of the programming, making it part of the opportunities to get to know one another and dig deeper and really explore more about ourselves is important. And when we are looking for our ERG leaders, making sure that those intersectional identities are there.
I love that, Beth. And since you both spoke to the importance of that, I could share a few ideas on how you can facilitate that in your organization. One idea is having a shared calendar for ERSG. So any event that goes on, people can say, hey, we'd love to collab with you on this. Let's make this an Afro-Latino session instead. Or, I have this great speaker I can pull in. So we also have Slack channels for our presidents to connect with presidents, for our vice presidents to connect with vice presidents, right? So they're all getting to know each other. They have donuts that they can meet up and pair with. But if you don't have those specific roles, you could say, hey, we are all part of the engineering department and then different ERSGs. Let's all get together. I think the more ways you can group leaders with and connect that to the roles at your company, get these conversations going across the board, the better. More opportunities for allyship.
Amazing. I love that advice, and that's such a big thing, just having that shared calendar, having that visibility, and finding the ways to collaborate. That's really cool. All right, so we have about 7 minutes left in the panel. We're going to end off on sort of the vision for the future of ERGs. But before that, I just want to do a lightning round of all the questions that we have here in the chat. So let's see, I'm going to look at the most upvoted ones. Question here from Yemi, and sorry if I mispronounce any of your names, but question from Yemi. When you first launch a new ERG, how have you been able to help new leaders manage their goals as well as the responsibilities that come with creating events, generating content, and keeping members engaged? Are there any frameworks or tools that have worked well?
Yeah, I can help answer that, and then I'd be curious to hear other thoughts too. For me, launching a new community is always about the community, right? So really letting the community drive the things that it's interested in, and the ways in which it wants to see impact. And what I mean by that is typically when we start a new community, we first create a space, we are promoting the space, we're letting people self-identify, self-select into the space, and then we're starting conversations, engaging what people are interested in. Each community tends to show up in very different ways, and they might be interested in doing different things. Some folks are really interested in doing volunteer activities. Some folks are really interested in that creating community safe space element as we're beginning, right? And it takes time. So harkening back to something I said earlier, I think really working with invested community members on one, creating the space, and then understanding the mission of that space, right? Who is it for? Why are you creating it? What do you want to do with the space? Having those fundamental things in place is super, super helpful in terms of establishing a starting place. And then, as you're going along, just keeping in mind that building a community takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. So really making sure that you're continuously evolving and continuing to seek, whether that's through surveys of the community, what people are interested in, but inviting others to give input and really take ownership of the community as well is super important.
Absolutely.
And
Really great advice.
one thing we've done is have like a listening tour of our senior execs, like our chief human resource officer, for example, had a listening tour amongst our 8 ERGs, and knowing that somebody that high up is listening so intently, I think also fosters a great deal of momentum and excitement and engagement, right? Where people feel like, oh, this is not just a for me, by me type of thing, that the company actually cares and the company's listening. I think having that kind of executive, senior, beyond just ERG executive sponsors, actually, op staff members and, C-suite folks being heavily engaged and having that kind of exposure, I think, is
Yeah.
usually a really good silver bullet.
Absolutely. That's huge. Question here from Scarlett. How do you ensure that ERGs and ERG leaders are impacting their communities both internally and externally, besides removing the admin work behind running these groups?
Marsha, read that last part again. Besides what?
Besides removing the admin work behind running these groups.
Mm. Well, I think it goes back to what Beth was saying, like, once you establish what it is that each of these groups want to do, then you always compare, you measure against plan, right? What did you set out to do? And then what are you doing? And making sure there's both qualitative and quantitative ways to trace it back, is what I'd say. Sorry, Abby, you were starting to say something.
Go ahead, Abby.
Yeah, no, I exactly what you said, just setting those goals. It's about the goal setting exercises, having that mission, and making sure that you're out to complete it. So
I think also creating opportunities for conversations with stakeholders within the company who have the power to really change policy, right? Like creating opportunities for your ERG leaders to present feedback from the community to your HR team, to your benefits team, to your CEO, right? Really having the space for those accessible and transparent conversations. And for me as a program manager, helping logistically to plan those spaces and facilitating those spaces.
we also did business impact presentations for ERGs to present to C-suite on how they use their budgets, what was the impact of each event that they focused on. And a lot of events were external facing, right? They was getting out into the community. So we have our different pillars that we think about for ERGs too.
I was just going to add, it's okay to change goals midstream as well, because we started out saying we wanted to do a ton of work in the community, which we did. And then we were like, wait a minute, why are we doing all this out here when we need to actually tend to our own backyard, right? Like we have a lot of accessibility advances that we need to make within the 4 walls of Adobe. So let's start in our own backyard and work out inside out. And so we started out and then we came back in, and I think, ebb and flow with what the needs of the community is. So
Yeah, really great advice, everyone. All right, so we'll take one more question from the audience. There's actually 2 questions that flow really nicely together. So from Gina and Danny, how do you recruit or present the opportunities to internal team members to participate in your ERGs? And do you kind of define a term limit for this type of role?
I can start with this one. I've heard a lot of different structures about the term limits. At Uncork, we decided to go for a whole calendar year, so from January to December of a given year. But I see how it makes sense to keep some members on for another year to make sure that things are being continued on. I've heard people do 3 members switch the following year and it switches every other year, something like that. So 1 to 2 years, but making sure that there is space for new folks to join and take those roles if they want to is good. And also to relieve pressure if someone does, our jobs change all the time, our roles change, life gets crazy. So to be able to be flexible there is key. And then as far as, I lost this question. Sorry, I'm looking.
Yeah, no, it's I hit the question once we started answering it. But the other part of the question was about recruitment.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we had each of our ERSG groups present info sessions. So we asked them to come up with an info session. This was something that my team provided the structure for. So sharing your mission, your vision, your why to get involved in this, what are the personal benefits of it, what are career benefits of it, and what kind of time requirements should you be thinking about, or recommendations, about how much time is it going to take each week to focus on this. And then we shared it everywhere. Hey, join the session. Hey, all the channels, all of the communications, newsletters, everything. So people really knew about the opportunities and were able to join. Now, there's also a process, and we leave this up to the ERSGs to decide what they want to do, but we have elections, or some people just self-nominate and like, oh, I want to take president role. And some teams are like, cool, we got our full team. While other teams are like, there's a lot of interest, so they do election style. So they'll have 5 people running for president and just do a vote. So there's a lot of different ways you can go about that.
I think a lot of that is, really dependent on the organization. We also do an application and election process, which I think does help make it very equitable. And we also have certain requirements for ERG leadership in terms of, how long you've been at the company, what your performance rating is, right, to qualify to apply. But, more importantly, I think if your organization really values ERGs, values the work that they do, celebrates the impact of the work they do consistently, then it's an exciting opportunity for folks to get involved. And even beyond that, when we're talking about executive sponsors, our executive sponsors are all levels of the C-suite. And they are very high touch and involved with our ERGs. And therefore, when ERG elections come around, ERG leadership is something that's looked at as very, very respected and encouraged within the organization. So executive sponsors then will reach out to their direct reports to say, hey, either you or if you know someone great on your team, this is a great way to improve leadership skills, to improve connections within the company. Like, nominate your team members who you think would be great, nominate yourselves, I'll nominate X, Y, and Z, right? So really making it something that's valued concretely in the company by the highest levels of leadership is crucial, because then when you have those seasons where you're looking for applications, people will be excited to apply.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I have a quick question for you, Beth. Was there a certain amount of time that it took once you had the executive buy-in, once to see that momentum going? Was it, like, that's what I'm trying to say, is like, how many years did it take before people are like, wow, this is a no-brainer, this is work that everyone supports?
I think, well, I will say it's different at every organization, right? At Etsy in particular, we have always been, and our CEO specifically has always been very, very, very bought in to ERG communities and the power they hold. I do think that it takes a little bit of time to establish it as part of, I hate using the word culture because I feel like there's like so many problematic things with saying the culture, right? But it does take a little bit of time for anything to become a cultural norm, right? For something to be normalized, even if it's like a really wonderful thing. But it comes from, in addition to grassroots level, bottom up, top down. And so if your C-suite is really bought in and involved, they will have their teams be bought in and involved, right? So if you can tap into your C-suite as allies in the role of executive sponsor, I think is a great way, right? They'll really understand the importance and drive the importance from the top down, in addition to the excitement from the bottom up. right?
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
That's really interesting, really great advice. All right, so we're a few minutes over. I do want to end off on just sort of sharing each of your vision for the future of ERGs. When you think about your programs for 2022, what is something that you're really excited about, and what do you think is the future of ERGs? Avi, I'll start with you for this one.
Okay. With remote first being a huge trend and these hybrid work models, I really see this as something that could turn into a global network. I'd love to see, we have veterans networks, we have women's networks, but we are still lacking a centralized place for ERGs to celebrate the work they do, support each other in their efforts, and collaborate on what's next and how to drive deeper impact as a collective. But with access to our technology and an uptick in our remote work and virtual communities, it feels like a natural step would be uniting all of these elements and bringing together this incredible community of people. I know a big goal for us in 2022 is to host a joint event that can connect different ERGs in the fintech space. So this could be the beginning of something much bigger.
That's incredible. I'm so excited for something like that to happen as well, and I'm going to be staying tuned. Beth, what about you? How are you thinking about the future of these programs?
Oh, you're muted.
Oh, you're muted. Yeah. Oh no. Okay. No worries. I will jump to Ronnie next, and I know we're a little bit over.
Sorry, I was frozen, so I wasn't able to.
Oh no.
But you can go to Ronnie first.
Okay. Yeah. Let's jump to Ronnie, and then we'll end off on you, Beth.
So one of the things I've been thinking about is we've got these global, our ERGs are absolutely global. They're organized by, the backgrounds and characteristics. But then I thought, there's a lot of work that we do by business unit, right? By line of business. And so what I'd love to see is, in addition to these global units, right? How can we infiltrate each of the business units, and how do we? I'm still kind of thinking through how this could go, and this is still discussion that we're having as exec chairs. Is there a way to have a microcosm of these networks kind of built into the business units? Because much like we're saying, having shared KPIs with each individual, like if an actual line of business was also responsible for specific DE&I KPIs, I just think it would stick more, and it would just have more momentum. So haven't truly fleshed that out, but just stuff that we're grappling with and kind of experimenting on. All about driving impact and making it so that it's a company aspiration as opposed to a grassroots by the employee for the employee kind of thing. Like if the company cares about it and they're putting their money behind it, and people's RSUs and actual payouts are dependent on these programs working, then I feel like that's how to drive it home.
Absolutely. All right, and Beth, we'll leave it with you for this one.
Yeah, something we're thinking about a lot right now. And I mentioned earlier that we have a remote employee resource group, is as most companies go back, ours included, to this hybrid way of working, how are we ensuring that our experiences remain equitable across, folks who are working in office or folks who are completely remote? And this touches on a lot of intersectional identities as well, right? Because a lot of the things that, for example, the disability community has been asking for forever, like more access to virtual events, more access to virtual opportunities in general, those have become much more common in the past couple of years, right? We don't want to see that accessibility go away, because we know that accessibility benefits everyone. One, it's benefiting remote workers, right? Because it's creating an equity of experience. It's benefiting parents or caregivers who might not be able to attend in-person opportunities because of scheduling or whatever it may be. So we're really thinking critically about how, as we move into a hybrid workforce, we are maintaining a sense of inclusion for every employee in a way that feels equal in a way where every employee feels just as part as the community as someone else. And do I think that that means we'll completely get rid of all in-person interaction? Absolutely not, right? At the end of the day, it's very hard to substitute face-to-face interaction. But in our approach, it means that when we're planning these large impact moments that we feel really proud of, that we want to, put a lot of exposure behind, a lot of advertising behind, a lot of promotion behind, we should have a virtual first approach. And what does that look like? And how do we do it in a way that isn't burning people out when everybody is feeling pretty screen fatigued, right? So that's a huge consideration for us this year. And our remotes ERG is going to be really instrumental in what that approach looks like.
Yeah, that's a really interesting insight, and I think a lot of companies are thinking about this, like how do we make it equal for folks that are coming in hybrid, and for those that are staying remote, how do we create opportunities for both? So I love your thinking around that. Awesome. All right. So everybody, thank you so much again for taking the time for speaking on this panel. There were so many great insights. I have so many notes, so many great learnings. I feel like we could have kept this conversation going for another hour or two. There's so many more interesting topics in this realm. But again, just want to say a huge thank you for taking the time to participate and to be here with us. And thank you to all of you who had such great questions. I wish that we could do a standing ovation for our incredible panelists, but in the virtual world, let's everybody throw our favorite emojis in the chat.